Stay tuned for tonight's adventure with the Fat Man.
Okay, here we go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I hope it's good to be where you are because I'm really excited to be here today. My name is Baltimore Fats, and this is Burn, baby, burn! Yeah! Okay, happy Guy Fawkes Day, everyone. So the other day, my friend Dora Vernon and I were talking about Halloween and how it's changed in recent years, and she was lamenting that Halloween had seemed to taken over for Guy Fawkes Day or Bonfire Day, which I'd never really heard of before. If I had, I'd forgotten about it. And so we talked about that for a little while, and I thought it was a good story. And a little bit later on, I mentioned to her that I didn't know what I was going to do next for my show, and she suggested I do something on Guy Fawkes because Bonfire Day was still a few days away, so it would still be timely, right? And so here we are. We're going to do an episode about Bonfire Day or Guy Fawkes Day or Gunpowder Treason Day or Pope's Day, all these different days for the same day, right? And so here we go, right? In England, Guy Fawkes Night was started in response to or in reaction of the Gunpowder Plot. And so this is a cover for one of those propagandist pamphlets that they used to print out for these things, the indoctrination of these stories into the general public. So they become accepted, right? And, they did it for Mervyn Touche, and who knows how many other events were seeded into the population this way, planted, as it were, right? And all right, so the Gunpowder Plot was a conspiracy to blow up the House of Lords with King James and Parliament inside, which, if successful, its conspirators, who were mostly angry Jesuit Catholics, right, and their priests, they hoped to restore Catholicism to the crown. But an anonymous letter tips the crown off to the plot, and poor Guy Fawkes is busted sitting on 36 barrels of gunpowder stashed underneath the House of Lords with a tinderbox in his pocket, just his luck, right? And so the scheme fails, right? But before I move on with the scheme and everything, I just want to point out this woodcut of Westminster, right? Because Westminster is where the House of Lords is, right? And so now I know this is probably not an eyewitness representation here, but this is the artist's impressions of what Westminster looked like, right, in the early 1600s. And look at all of these towers, a lot of which are not connected to buildings. So all these potential obelisks or other towers hanging out back here. What purpose could they have served in early 1600s Westminster? It's very sort of interesting to see that there. And so now after the failure of the Gunpowder Plot, what Parliament does is it starts to allow bonfires and celebrations in honor of the king's survival of this fiendish plot. And over time, this develops to include effigies of Guy Fawkes within the bonfires. All right, here's a good picture of it here. And over the years, the effigies would include everyone from the Pope to Adolf Hitler or to whatever hated political figure there was of any given era. If you gave them a reason to burn you in effigy, they were going to do it, right? And they were going to do it on November 5th. And over time, these celebrations evolved beyond just bonfires and fireworks and that type of celebration, because eventually the festival begins to feature children toting around a Guy Fawkes effigy and asking people for pennies. Right? And now what they would do with the pennies, and so what they would do is they would tote this guy around and they would say penny for the guy. And what they would do is they would buy fireworks with all the pennies they were able to collect throughout the day. And then at the end of the night, they would throw the effigy into the bonfire and light off their fireworks. And now I think this sign is great here. And these clever kids, looks like they were asking for 3 pence instead of a penny, due to a rise in the cost of living. Right? And look at this kid's messy face. All right, is that deliberately, like, is this part, like he drew on a beard to be like Guy Fawkes? But this was very common in the 19th and 20th centuries, at least up midway through the 20th century anyway. And so for centuries, this was a very important state holiday. And in some years, the holiday was co-opted by radical political movements. And that follows through to today, to Anonymous's use of the Guy Fawkes mask. This mask, of course, made popular by V for Vendetta, which I have never seen or read, by the way, but the holiday and its political revelry, whether survival of the Anglican monarchy or anti-political activism, it all feels like a whitewash to me for what I think may have been really going on with the creation of this holiday. Its dual purpose, right? And that centers around the bonfires, because not knowing about Guy Fawkes at all I see when I look at this picture is The Wicker Man. And now, if you haven't seen The Wicker Man, I highly recommend it. And so now I have bonfires on my mind, right? And so I want to know, how frequent were they in use, and what they tell us was Celtic religious practice. And though there were or are many reasons to ritualistically or symbolically light a fire, big bonfires were generally saved for quarter day festivals. And so now, prior to the advent of Christianity in Ireland and in pagan Ireland in the 5th century AD, the Celtic quarter days were observed, and they were the following, right? They were Imbolc on February 1st, Beltane on May 1st. So I'm going with Lunazad here on August 1st. And of course, the most famous one, perhaps, Samhain, the one that would tie in with Guy Fawkes Day on November 1st. Because something's telling me there's not a coincidence between the date of the November 5th bonfire day and what used to be the bonfire day of Samhain back in the day, right? And so I found this article on fire worship, written by one James Bonwick. And I love this name, Bon, like bonfire, and wick. Wicks sustain the flame in a candle or on a torch of some sort, right? And this article was written in 1894, so it's going to have some good stuff in it, right? And so it's a relatively lengthy article, so I'll leave a link for it, but I just chose a few paragraphs, that I thought were really interesting, right? And so it says that pyrolatria, or fire worship, was once nearly universal. And that makes sense, right? Fire being as important to the human animal as it is. The Moloch of the Canaanites, Phoenicians, and Carthaginians was the divinity of various nations under different names. Moloch was not the only deity tormenting simple maids and tender babes with fire. The blazing or fiery cross was well known in both Ireland and Scotland. The Egyptians, with more modern Africans, have reverenced flame. And so this is kind of an interesting sentence to me. The Egyptians with more modern Africans. What is he saying there? That Egyptians are modern Africans? What is he really suggesting here in 1894? It's just curious, the wording to me. I don't know. All right, so I also found this bit on the perpetual lamps of the ancients, right? It says that these perpetual lamps of the ancients sanctioned the same idea of fire worship, right? No less than 170 Roman, Arab, and medieval writers record the finding of such lamps. So they definitely had lamps, 170 writers throughout the millennia, right? In 1540, a lamp was reported still burning in the tomb of Cicero's daughter. Lights were buried in urns. What kind of lights were they, And I'm sure there's videos out there on this stuff that I just didn't look up for this presentation here, right? Herodotus speaks of lamps in the tombs of Egypt. Augustine wrote of lights indistinguishable by either rain or wind. And this is the best here. It says, Madame Blavatsky says that Buddhist priests made use of asbestos wicks. The Buddhists didn't say this. It took Madame Blavatsky to do this, right? And Dr. Westcott here says the art of the perpetual lamp has been lost, right? So kind of curious stories about these lamps, right? And so now this next bit gets to the Celtic beliefs in Ireland and the bonfires, right? Because that's what I was after here. I was looking to support the idea of bonfires in the quarter day festivals, right? And so now the writer goes on to state that in Ireland at the time, 2 sects were said to be in the island. And I like that it's in the island and not on the island. And the first, of course, were the Baalites, or fire adorers, right? And the other were the Learites, or devotees of water, right? It is probable that very violent contentions were once carried on in Ireland by the partisans of the rival religions, who were accustomed to meet and decide their quarrels at the place set apart for the battle. The Samhains devoted to fire worship, and the Swans to Lear worship. So fire and water would battle it out at certain festivals for these Baalites and Learites. And it's certainly no coincidence that they're called Baalites in Celtic Ireland. And someday there'll be more on that. Right? And midsummer fires, now this would be Beltane, the Baalites festival, right? They served as sun charms to keep up the heat, to make summer warm and prosperous, right? Midsummer's Eve, however, afterwards nominated as John Baptist's Eve, was a great fire day far and wide. Von Buch, the traveler, speaks of seeing the custom observed within the Arctic Circle. So that far north, right? And I love this guy's name was Von Buch, right? The book. He wrote the book, this traveler, and he saw this custom in the Arctic Circle. So as Easter Day was of old devoted to Astarte, who is the Lady of Elk, right, who's here in Baltimore, right, the Eastern goddess, so was St. John's Day to Baal. But the eve of the first November was the Hallow Eve, or Samhain, or Samhain, when the fires were a thanksgiving to the sun at the end of harvest. And we talked about this, of course, all the great fires in America. These are fire rituals that date back as well. And so now what I think is really happening here with this Guy Fawkes Day or Bonfire Day, what they did was they used it as a political tool to convert the pagan holiday of Samhain to a state-sponsored holiday, right? Because I know what was happening in the court of King James at the time of this alleged gunpowder plot. And that's the plantation of Ulster, right? I've been knee deep in the royal courts of this era for a while now, right? So I know that King James's court is going full press with its Ulster campaign. It's creating peerages and shipping Englishmen and Scotsmen over there like crazy, right? It's the crown's secret step to America, as that Poe research was showing, right? But he needs to be slick about it, right? Not only does he need to reward the old tribal clan kings, he has to set to ease the local populace, right? Because he's bringing in all of these foreigners, right? And right, so if you're going to go in and take over a land, you're going to eventually erase their whole history and supplant it with your own. Well, it would help to give them customs that would be familiar to their own, right? Create new holidays and traditions around their old ones, to familiarize themselves with you and your customs going forward, right? And so in this way, co-opting Samhain is a brilliant strategy, right? And not only does it appease those with Celtic roots, which were still showing strong as late as 1867, right? The old pagan fire worship still survives in Ireland, though nominally in honor of St. John. On Sunday night, bonfires were observed throughout nearly every county in the province of Leinster. Leinster? I'll never get it, right? That's the biggest county in Ireland along the east coast there. Right, and so could King James or his team or the writers of this fake history of ours, right? Could they just be using the gunpowder plot as a false flag type staged event to subtly shift the pagan holiday of Samhain and make it a state one? And I say that because, again, this was one of those things where these pamphlets were printed up every year to go along with these ceremonies. They retold the gunpowder plot tale time and time and time again and recycled it again every year for these parades to really hammer it into the narrative to make sure that was happening. And then, eventually, as time went on, it became supplanted by Halloween, because Halloween being a little more commercial, maybe finding new and better ways to profit with horror movies and candy and costumes and things like that. It's all, again, it became more of like a profit thing, I think, than a religious or political ceremony. And of course, our controllers are okay with that, right? Commerce is good for that, right? And so was Guy Fawkes just a patsy, or did he even exist at all? Because I couldn't find anything to suggest that he had children or any descendants or a family or anything like that. So he could just be one of these characters they sneak into the narrative to change the story. And so now I don't know what this idea of using Guy Fawkes as a patsy or a martyr for this cause does to the rest of the gunpowder plot and its conspirators. And so now all of this had me thinking that if this was going on in England and in Ulster at the time, then so too it must have been going on in the New World. Right? And sure enough, we most certainly had Guy Fawkes Day here in America, only they called it Pope Night. And here's a depiction of Pope Night in Boston, 1768. Right? And what it was an anti-Catholic holiday celebrated annually on November 5th in the colonial United States. Right? So it talks about how it evolves from Guy Fawkes Night. It says Pope Night was most popular in seaport towns of New England, especially in Boston, where it was an occasion for drinking, rioting, and anti-elite protest by the working class. It was, by all accounts, it was a massive party time in colonial America. Right? The earliest known celebration of Pope Night took place on November 5th, 1623. Like 1623, this is only like 3 years or so after the Pilgrims get to Plymouth, right? And they're doing this celebration. So very contemporary, right? And Plymouth, of course, not only for Plymouth Rock, but also that line from Fort Morgan went right through there. Right? And it says that it was started when a group of sailors built a bonfire which raged out of control and destroyed several nearby homes. And so apparently they didn't mind that so much. And by the late 17th century, annual festivities on November 5th were a New England tradition. Major celebrations were held in Boston, Marblehead, Newburyport, Salem, and Portsmouth. No shock there, right? And in 1702, locals in Marblehead held a bull baiting and distributed the meat to the poor. And I had to look that up. Bull baiting, it was essentially like they sicked dogs on a bull. And I'm sure they injured the bull first, too. It's a very cruel, inhumane thing that they did here. But they gave the meat to the poor, so I guess it all worked out for everybody. And at the height of its popularity, Pope Night in Boston was a 3-part ritual consisting of a procession in which effigies of the Pope and other figures were paraded through the streets, a battle between the processions from the north and south ends, and the burning of the effigies by the victors. And so now this was the ceremony all through this. Like I said, this was 1768, I think they said. This was something that was going on in that region from the early 1600s all the way through the late 1700s, some 150 years. Think about how close this is to what that article said about the Celtic tradition here. Right? It says that it is probable that very violent contentions were once carried out in Ireland by the partisans of the rival religions, who were accustomed to meet and decide their quarrels at the place set apart for battle. Now, this was something that would take place during these bonfires, and that's exactly what this sounds like to me. It is just ritual reenactment of these old Celtic traditions, happening right to the very end of the 18th century. And it wasn't just Boston. It was happening in New York, and this is a great article I'll link. Yeah, it was happening in New York as well, and I saw stories about it happening in Philadelphia and other northern cities, but it did not make it to Maryland, or if it did, it was done in secret because, of course, Maryland being very Catholic, and especially in Baltimore. But all right, so as I was saying, this goes on right to the very end of the 1700s, when in 1775, to avoid offending Canadian allies, and again, this seemed to be a very political move with the Catholics of Canada. George Washington is fighting a war against the British. He's got French allies. There's Catholics around. He doesn't want to upset his Catholic allies. So he issues an order forbidding any troops under his command from participating. And the last known Pope Night celebration in Boston took place in 1776. So after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, which is interesting, right? And though the tradition continued in other towns well into the 19th century, as noted here. All right, the tradition continued in Salem as late as 1817 and was still observed in Portsmouth, New Hampshire in 1892. Right? In the 1880s, bonfires were still being lit in some New England coastal towns, though no longer to commemorate the failure of the gunpowder plot. They created new reasons for it. And that in New York after 1845, they burned barrels on Election Day, which I guess was the first Tuesday in November. And that's the thing. All of this happening on November 5th. And again, who knows, with the calendar change and the way that they've done things, who knows, maybe November 5th really is November 1st. How would we know? We wouldn't, and having really no idea what the actual true date is, with all the made up dates that are out there. And so as I was saying, it was happening all over the Northeast, but not as far south as Maryland. Of course, Maryland being very Catholic, but I did go looking for it. And I found this fun little story here that doesn't really connect, but, I was like, well, let me look as far back as I can to see if I can find any mention in the Baltimore Sun of Gunpowder Treason Day or Guy Fawkes Day. So I decided to go to the very first November I could, which was 1837. And wouldn't you know it, they didn't have November 5th in there. I just can't believe that keeps happening to me. I go back looking for specific dates and they're just not there. Right? So I did look at November 6th, though, and I found this. All right, November 6th, 1837. We stopped the press to announce one of the largest fires with which our city has been visited for some time. It broke out last evening about 10 o'clock. So on the 5th, Guy Fawkes Day, right, in the center of the square, bounded by Charles, Hanover, Pratt, and Camden Streets. This is right downtown by the Inner Harbor. Right, the fire was first discovered in Mr. Redgrave's livery stable, which was soon enveloped in flames, and the wind being high at the time, it communicated to a number of adjoining wooden buildings and sheds that shared the same fate. So just property damage, thankfully everybody got out, all the good stuff got out, nothing really valuable was lost, but these wooden buildings, right? And so now, of course, this just reads as coincidence, or, this was one of those like insurance fires or one of those fires that was set to clear out a couple city blocks right downtown for the building of new, I'm sure, red brick structures, right? And some of those other older buildings down there. Interesting, though, that there would be a fire in Baltimore on November 5th, which was this Pope's Day, this anti-Catholic day. And also, again, seeing as in Baltimore that all the religions were really represented in very close quarters downtown. It wouldn't surprise me that there could have been some pagan bonfire ritual in the square bounded by Charles, Hanover, Pratt, and Camden streets. I don't know. It's just speculation. All right, so I'm going to close out with a couple of final thoughts here on Guy Fawkes Night and whether or not this could have been like a psyop foisted on the people to change their religious practices and create state holidays or even holidays around which political activism could be deliberately stoked, and how that may relate to the anonymous of today. Who knows? I don't know. But, it definitely reeks of them building this as a story and not as a real event. And so I'm going to close this one out with a cherry I found while looking for examples of Guy Fawkes Night in Baltimore or Maryland, right? And I found this story, which is really amazing. All right, so now this article is from November 26, 1898. Interesting that it's well after Guy Fawkes Day, right? But it says, Guy Fawkes, is he like everything else in history, a myth? Or was there really a gunpowder plot? Is he like everything else in history, a myth? William Hurlin here is calling everything in history a myth, right? And so William Hurlin of New Hampshire writes to the Boston Transcript as follows. And again, also interesting that I don't understand why this editorial was of interest to the Baltimore Sun on November 26th. But William Hurlin says, are there any plain facts which a plain man is at liberty to believe? Or are we to conclude that everything which has been written in history is now to be set down as fiction? Right? Everything which has been written as history, set down as fiction. I ask these questions because I see in your issue of November 3rd a letter from Wentworth Sparehawk, in which he writes, the whole story of the gunpowder plot looks to us now almost incredible. He adds, examples of such inventions will readily occur to the reader, and says still further, no weight ought to be given to the alleged confessions of Fawkes, thus intimating that the truth of the story depends on these confessions. Sir Richard Baker wrote his Chronicle of the Kings of England in 1641, only 36 years after the discovery of the gunpowder plot. And his book was so popular that it passed through 4 editions in 24 years. I have before me a still later edition, published in 1684. So whoever this guy is, he has a 1684 edition of Sir Richard Baker's Chronicle of the Kings of England. This would be over 200 years later. And he finds in it a circumstantial account of the discovery of the plot through a warning letter sent by one of the conspirators to his friend Lord Monteagle, and the statement that upon search being made, 36 barrels of powder were found covered with wood under the Parliament House in which the king was to open Parliament, and that Guy Fawkes himself was found there with a tinderbox and torchwood in his pocket. And further fact is stated of King James I that not to be unthankful to God for the deliverance, he caused the 5th of November, being the day of the discovery, to be kept holy, with prayers and thanksgiving to God, which was then solemnly performed, and hath been since. Now, King James says this, that the day of November 5th be kept holy, with prayers and thanksgiving. As my fire worship article states, the eve of the 1st of November was the Hallow Eve or Samhain or Samhain, when the fires were a thanksgiving. King James states that these fires should be a thanksgiving. He just transferred the day from November 1st to November 5th. So there has to be some sort of reason for that. So let's get back to that article real quick. They're going to continue this tradition of Thanksgiving on November 5th forever, right? And so now I pass to Green's History of the English People and find again the same statement about the discovery of the plot, though much condensed, with the discovery of the cellar and of Guido Fawkes. And it's interesting, I didn't go into the history of Fawkes because, again, in terms of this story, not so much necessary. But he used the pseudonym Guido when he was an agent for the Jesuits in Spain, trying to get the Spanish to support this Catholic takeover of the throne and the gunpowder plot. He says, now I turn to the cyclopedias, which I happen to have in my possession. This guy is a scholar, right? In the Penny Cyclopedia, I find a long and circumstantial account of the plot and its discovery, right? In Chambers' Encyclopedia, I again find the gunpowder plot spoken of as if it were a veritable fact. Again, here we are, 1890s, this guy saying this thing should not be considered a fact, right? And he talks about all the ways that they interject the story throughout history. But it now seems that all these authorities are unreliable and that we must regard the whole story as a myth because Mr. Wentworth Sparhawk thinks the whole story of the gunpowder plot looks to us now almost incredible and far too much like the numerous plots which witnesses and the police have invented or fomented throughout English history. All right, so now I didn't do this. I'm going to have to Google Mr. Wentworth Sparhawk here. So I don't know about the intention of this article, whether this is sarcasm on the part of William Herlin, or is he trying to support Mr. Sparhawk here? So let's Google Mr. Sparhawk. Let's Google these gentlemen quickly, shall we? And so I have to believe that this is the William Herlin that we're looking for, Reverend William Herlin Jr., born July 31st, 1814 in London, dies in New Hampshire, 28th of June, 1910. He's 95. So he would have been like 80 or something like that when he was writing this editorial or whatever it was. And so now that's all they have for him here. Let's see if there's anything else. And so the Rev here was apparently a very influential Baptist priest in the New Hampshire, northern Massachusetts area. And he wrote a book about the Baptists of New Hampshire and things like that. So, but just amazing to me that he would have this background from London and be calling out the story of the gunpowder plot. And so let's see what we can find out about Sparhawk. Let's see. And so just quickly, I couldn't find anything about Wentworth Sparhawk here, but I'm sure if I went looking in here in materials for a genealogy of the Sparhawk family in New England, I might find something, but I'm not going to do that today. All right, so I'm going to wrap up Guy Fawkes in the story of whether or not Guy Fawkes Day was co-opted into Samhain, or whether Samhain is now co-opted Guy Fawkes Day back, or however you want to look at it. I don't know. I thought it was kind of a fun story to tell around this time of year. Glad I could get a timely one in there. And remember, guys, just because you don't know the truth doesn't mean you can't have fun with the lies, right? And so until the next one, cheers, guys.